Kenya is wading deeper into the territorial dispute with Somalia and is considering deploying the military to the disputed border with a neighbor if the National Assembly approves a motion tabled by Majority Leader Aden Duale.
Well, the motion seeks to compel the government to explore other ways of protecting the country's territory if the other diplomatic avenues fail to push back Somalia from the contested area, where it's put up the oil blocks for auction at the end of the year.
Our senior legal affairs reporter, Ken Mijungu, has a perspective on this.
It's only weeks to a landmark ruling that will determine who owns the oil blocks claimed by Kenya but annexed by Somalia in the Indian Ocean. But already Kenya is taking steps to pile pressure on Somalia to honor agreements that have seen the two countries respect their respective boundaries. Majority Leader Aden Duale presented a motion he co-authored with Minority Leader John Mbadi, seeking to compel the government to explore other ways to protect Kenya's territorial integrity. The motion is yet to be debated since the House Business Committee has not allocated debate time, but will likely be on the floor on Thursday before Parliament goes for recess.
Considering that the determination of the case will be made in September 2019 and Kenya is exposed to irregular losing up to 26% of its exclusive economic zone and 85% of the continental shelf.
Duale wants members of parliament to take urgent steps to implement in full the provisions of the Maritime Zones Act with regards to the delimitation of the northern boundary of the exclusive economic zone with the Federal Republic of Somalia through the agreement envisioned by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Coastal States, engage the federal government of Somalia to resolve the boundary dispute through diplomacy and dispute resolutions mechanisms available under the African Union, the Intergovernmental Authority for Development, and the East Africa Community. Kenya will also protest to the United Nations against the assertion of the jurisdiction by the International Court of Justice over the maritime border conflict, and as a last option, deploy the Kenya Defence Forces to the subject boundary to undertake the responsibility of protecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the country. This dispute has been debated in the Somalia parliament, and Kenya now says unless by way of a referendum where Kenyans resolve to alter their territory, she will not cede even an inch of its space. Somalia in February put on auction offshore oil blocks in the contested territory. The winning bidder could begin exploration in January of 2020. Ken Mijungu, NTV.
All right, well, NTV's Ken Mijungu joins us now live in studio to shed more light on this important issue. Ken, where did all this start?
Right, Smriti, to understand this, you have to go back to history, and I'll try and explain this through history a bit. And it takes us back to the year 1924. Now, this is a time that identifiable borders between Kenya and Somalia were drawn. That's back in 1924. 40 years later, in 1964, the Organization of African Union makes this resolution and tells countries you have to preserve your own borders. But 4 years before then, that's 1960, Somalia had just achieved its independence, and Somalia was not subscribing to this OAU. So what happens is that Somalia fails to recognize this resolution of preservation of borders. So Somalia tries to be a little bit stable, and between 1963 and 1967, there was an expansionist idea by Somalia. So it means Somalia was getting into other countries' borders as much as they could. And that is the time, Smriti, remember the Shifta Wars. And this was later corrected. And through the Arusha Accord, through the Prime Minister of Somalia, that's Mohamed Igal. Then Said Barre comes in, and immediately what does he do? He decides that he's not going to recognize the African Union, the Organization of African Union resolution. So Said Barre is sitting in power, and in 1981, let's jump to 1981. So he decides to stop these expansionist ideas and let Kenya stay with its boundaries in 1981. So let's take you to 1982, and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Coastal States allows countries to establish mutual economic zones. So when that happens, Kenya back in 1979, they had gotten their own boundaries, but without this convention by the United Nations Convention of the Coastal States. So Kenya had to domesticate this, and a Law Maritime Act was established to domesticate this in Kenya. So this continues, and luckily back in 1981, Said Barre denounces that. So Kenya is now stable, but in 1991, Somalia yet again descends into anarchy, Smriti. So what happens? Kenya never had an opportunity to renegotiate with Somalia in spite of what has been happening until 2014, when Somalia decides to refer this matter to the International Court of Justice. And that's where we are today, Smriti.
And with that historical perspective, let's look forward. And very soon, there will be a very important ruling. Then what?
It means Kenya has to agree with that ruling or disagree with it, and it means Somalia will get what it wants because it believes it will get justice from ICJ. But that is the reason why what we're reporting on today is happening, because Kenya has moved ahead to pile pressure, and they want to go back to the Anglo-Italian Treaty of 1924, when these borders were divided into 29 equal boundaries or identifiable boundaries. So that's what they're banking on. They're banking on all these legislations and conventions over time from OAU 1964, and they are hoping that indeed the ICJ, while making that decision next month, will indeed consider what has been happening since 1924, so that they remain with this border, so that the territorial integrity of Kenya and Somalia is not compromised. And remember, apart from just the fact that Somalia has been suffering as a country, because of that suffering in Somalia, we've had infiltration by militia groups such as Al-Shabaab, making it very difficult for the relationship between Kenya and Somalia. But all in all, the hope is come September, there'll be a favorable ruling. But the first option from Parliament is indeed to get a mutual agreement between the Somalian government and the Kenyan government without necessarily invoking the last one, which is the military option, Mark.